Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel at what I can't believe I am saying is the midpoint of the year. Yeah, we're halfway through 2023 and as scary as that is, there is no better time to reflect on the books that we've read in the first half of the year, and that's what I'm doing today. I wanted to share with you my favourite books I've read so far in 2023. I'm pretty much on track for my reading goal according to Goodreads. It's been a little bit like hit or miss. So the first part of the year, I was really ahead of it. Like I was bish bash boshing through the books, and then just, you know, life. So I fell behind quite a bit, and I read a bunch of romance books that were really quick to get through, and I caught back up again, and then I fell back down again, and I'm like kind of spot on. I'm either exactly on track or one book behind, which feels absolutely acceptable. I mean, I'm saying all this as if it matters. I literally couldn't care less whether I meet my reading goal. Well, I could care maybe like 1%, but it's nice to keep track. So with that ramble out of the way, I really am a rambler these days, I wanted to tell you about the books of those that I've read so far, which is around 50 or so, I think maybe 49, that I've loved the most. The ones that I would really highly recommend to a lot of people watching this video right now and would like to talk about a little bit more and promote a little bit more. So yeah, let's get into the books, shall we? So these are in absolutely no particular order. I love them all, and the first one I'm going to talk to you about is Rose Daughter by Robin McKinley. Now this is really interesting from my perspective because it's the second Beauty and the Beast retelling I read by Robin McKinley. Robin McKinley has written two completely different Beauty and the Beast retellings, and I think it's really interesting once you've read both to compare them, because the earlier one that Robin McKinley wrote, which was called Beauty, is a much more like traditional, you know, follows like almost exactly the folktale she's basing it on, but with like her gorgeous prose and atmosphere and detailed descriptions of character and world. So, you know, she brings that story to life 100%, but without radically changing anything, whereas in Rose Daughter, she does some things that are a lot more different. She kind of plays a lot more with the story, the original story, and creates something quite new but within the structure of the original, and it means that as a reader there's more surprises and there's more depth to characters that maybe like don't have as much depth in the original, and there's a lot more like exploration of relationships and themes, and she finds ways to kind of deepen the magic and explore the motivations behind what might have been a curse and the relationships the Beast had prior to becoming the Beast. And then also, like I said, there are some surprises in there, which is really, really nice from a reader's perspective. You get the recognisable, but also the surprises that, like, there's, what other word am I supposed to use there? You get both of those things, which is a really nice balance, and I think that's one of the reasons I love a fairy tale retelling. It's interesting to see what someone can do with a recognisable story. And as always, I really enjoy Robin McKinley's writing. I find it very like soft and lyrical and comforting and transportive. It takes me to this other world in a little cozy bubble of fantasy, and I really, really enjoyed that, as well as the development of the relationship between Beauty and the Beast. The fairy tale itself, I'm sure you're already probably quite familiar with, but for anybody who would like a brief synopsis, this is about our protagonist, who is part of a very wealthy family. Her mother died when she was very young, but she grew up alongside her two sisters and her father, and she actually has a really good relationship with her two sisters, a relationship which only improves when they lose all their money. So they basically lose all of their money and they have to move out to the countryside to a cottage that they've inherited. There they have to start new lives for themselves. They have to find ways to work and to live off the land and to contribute to the village they're now a part of. So a large part of it is also just that aspect of it, and it's not just the romance, which I enjoyed, but it's also about this family adapting to this new situation, and it's really nicely done. And then of course there is a beast in a castle that insists that Beauty come and live with him, and things transpire from there, but you never completely find yourself separated from the life of her sisters and father, so you can equally get invested in their stories, which is really nice. And I have to say, I think I like this one better than Beauty. I liked Beauty, the other Robin McKinley retelling of this fairy tale. It was excellent, but it was a lot more like predictable and standard, whereas this book felt like a lot richer and a lot more unique and captivating because of that. So yeah, that is the first book on my list. So the next book on my list is kind of more of a series favourite, because I've read the first 2 books in this series, which is a trilogy, this year, and loved both equally, so I can't really pick one necessarily, and for that reason I'll kind of just like lump them together and talk about them together. I also assume I'm gonna adore and love book 3 as well, but I haven't gotten around to it. And those are Wicked and the Wallflower and Brazen and the Beast by Sarah MacLean. So these are historical romance novels set in 19th century London, and both novels follow a more well-to-do woman. They're definitely of the upper classes, but they're not necessarily like royal adjacent. They're not like the top tier of the aristocracy, and in fact the family in book 2 are more of a like merchant class who have been like upgraded for their work. Meanwhile, the love interests in both books are brothers who are pretty wealthy. They are definitely not aristocracy, but they are very wealthy, and they have made their money basically like running Covent Garden and having both a legitimate business, trade business, and a less legitimate trade business, but that has like sort of given them the power to be in charge of this area of London, and you know, they run it with a tight fist, but you know, they don't mistreat women and children, and they make sure everybody's safe while they like run fighting rings and stuff like that. It's all very much like the tropes you come to love and expect from romance, and I am equally as it's all the tropes that you love and have come to expect from historical romance, and I'm here for it. I really enjoy it. And actually one of my favourite things about this series was that we did get a little, if still, you know, fictional and tangential exposure to the lives of people in like Covent Garden and the more rundown parts of London at this time, rather than just the like richest echelons of society. And we got to see like a different lifestyle. I'm not saying this is in any way historical fiction that could be adapted into a documentary by any means, but I enjoyed the richness with which the author painted Covent Garden in London, and hearing about it. And she'd obviously done quite a bit of research into what these places were like back in the day. I mean, like Covent Garden now is very affluent in London. It was not back then. And I enjoyed that. Like, I enjoyed the meeting of the different worlds in these books, and I also loved the meeting of the love interests in both cases. I do believe that Lady Henrietta Sedley in book 2 was my favourite, but I loved them both, and they were both women like looking for power in a world in which, because of their sex, power was denied to them. And I enjoyed the way in which they just like tried to grab it with 2 fists, and the power in simply doing that. I loved them as like powerful women who had wants and desires and who followed through on that. It was fantastic, and I enjoyed the love interests, even if they were like complete idiots a lot of the time. You know, this is something you find in romance in general, which is the one love interest at least is very resistant to the idea of being in love, even though they quite clearly are, and it takes them a million years to realise it. It's still fun to follow along, and these books really tick the boxes for me. They really cemented Sarah MacLean as a favourite historical romance writer for me, and I cannot wait to read book 3. I do actually have some historical non-fiction on this list, however, so let's talk about that next. Book 3 is The Once and Future Sex by Eleanor Janega, and the subtitle of which is Going Medieval on Women's Roles in Society. So this is a medieval history book, and it explores the lives of women in the medieval era. Now, just to be clear, the medieval era is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and this book is a overview, so it by no means accounts for every aspect of women's lives or every single different women's lives in medieval times, or necessarily how they are potentially quite different in, say, 700 or compared to how they might have been in 1300, because of course things change. But it is a really interesting introduction to this topic. It's a really great overview of the subject that clearly demonstrates the author's passion for the subject and has a lot of really interesting information which is able to paint a really vivid picture in it. It contains a lot of interesting research, and although it isn't the biggest book and it does cover a long span of time, it manages to touch on quite a few different topics, which I really enjoyed. A lot of it, especially in the early chapters, boils down to men's attitudes to women and how women were perceived, and the different like ideas about like women's lives or women's nature that had potentially rolled over from antiquity, and how they played a role in women's lives in the medieval era, particularly in regard to the church. This book very heavily focuses on Europe, where Christianity and the church dominate, so it also like discusses the way in which the church manages women's lives, interpretations of Christianity at the time impacted women's lives, and then you also get to learn a little bit about the jobs women had and the like different ways in which women could exercise power, and that was really, really interesting as well. Like, I didn't know that women were running breweries in the medieval era, and that's not to say they were running breweries everywhere or there was as many women brewers as there was men, but there were women out there running businesses in medieval Europe, and I didn't realise this, especially in regard to, as I mentioned, the breweries. So that was really interesting, and I think it really built on my obviously existing knowledge about ancient women's lives and whetted my appetite to learn more about the minutiae of medieval women's lives in the different eras. So this was fantastic, really, really accessible. Like, I don't think you need to have prior knowledge to jump straight in and read it, written in a way that is both academic and accessible, which is like the best of both worlds. And I enjoyed that she kind of brought it back to how this pertains to modern women's lives in the conclusion or the conclusionary chapter, because I think that is something that is important when studying history, is looking at kind of maybe how some of these ideas have pervaded. So fantastic book. On the topic of non-fiction, I also want to mention Whatever Next on Adult Adoptee Identities, a book which is part of the 404 Inkling series, a series of short books on niche topics that I absolutely adore, have raved about endlessly on this channel, and even have a book of my own coming out in the series in January, which is all about the part in which queer retellings of Greek myths play in modern day queer culture. So yeah, if you're interested in that, I'll also link it down below. But back to Whatever Next, because this is a fantastic book. It's written by 3 authors, Josephine J, Adeline Barra, and Hannah Febin Smith. So all 3 women who came together to write this book met through a adult adoptee Facebook group, I think it was. Regardless, they met online in a group for people who were adoptees, and they were all as babies adopted out of China into families in either Britain or the US, and they became friends and got to know each other better through this like shared experience as adoptees, and started meeting in person, and their conversations and the way in which they supported each other and learned from each other sort of turned into this book, which is a reflection on their experiences as adoptees and now as adults, whether they have decided to seek out and talk to their birth family or have relationships with them or not. And I think this book was really eye-opening for me, because one thing I think, if you don't obviously have the experience of being an adoptee or being adoptee adjacent somehow, is that your information about adoption and the stories of adoption you usually hear are from the perspective of the adopters, the parents adopting a child. Like, there is the narrative that we hear the most, especially in media. There's endless films and TV episodes and overarching plots and series about people trying to adopt and to become parents, and it's usually painted as a very stressful but beautiful thing. Meanwhile, there are actually a lot of problems with the adoption industries in various different countries, regardless of how they work. It can be like the most idealistic adoption system ever, and that doesn't mean it can't still be exploitative. So it's something that I've been just learning more about from the perspective of adoptees, both through online media and hearing adoptees talk about it, and reading Whatever Next, which like I said, I think was a very eye-opening book. And in this instance, it's not even to say that the authors hate their adopted families or have entirely negative experiences of being adoptees. But even regardless of that, that doesn't mean there's not still issues regarding adoption, or there hasn't still been traumas that they've had to work through because of their experiences as adoptees. And it was really just nice to hear their personal experiences, which in some ways are very different and in other ways have a lot in common. And I think that was actually one of the great things about this book, is that it isn't just one person's experience, it was 3 people's experiences, and it was wonderful to read. I really enjoyed, like I said, hearing their perspectives and learning more about the institution of adoption through adoptee lenses. So yeah, really interesting. Next up is a new favourite from an old comfort author, and that is Moving Pictures by Terry Pratchett. So as much as I love Terry Pratchett's Discworld, there have for a number of years now been like a handful of books in that series that I've just almost refused to read, not because of the books themselves, but because I have like a very like specific personal relationship with the series, and I'm kind of terrified to finish it. Like, I'm terrified to have no more Discworld novels to read for the first time. But this year I did decide to read one more of those, and that was Moving Pictures, and luckily I loved it. I mean, there's rarely a Terry Pratchett book that I have not loved, except for Colour of Magic and Light Fantastic. But this one in particular, if you don't know, is about the invention of cinema in the Discworld. So there are a number of books within the Discworld series where you see the invention of modern technologies or modern systems. So there's like one about the invention of the like printing press and the first newspaper. There's a book about the first ever steam train and that's impact on the Discworld, and this is one of those books, but also maybe a little less flattering than some of the other books which depict a new industry and new inventions coming to the Discworld. I can't say that the picture of cinema painted in this book is a fantastic one complimentary wise, but it is really interesting and just really hilarious as always. It's a book that you could very much read by itself. It's a standalone with main characters who are not the main characters in other books in this series, although you will like encounter recurrent characters that have appeared in other books. So our protagonist is actually a wizard, or a wizard in training. It's a man who does not want to have to work hard in life, but who basically works incredibly hard not to have to work hard in life, which in its own sense is just Terry Pratchett doing his like very witty commentary, because I am sure there are many instances in all of our lives where we've basically ended up doing more work or stressing ourselves out more in order to not have to do something that really isn't that in order to not have to do something that really maybe wouldn't have taken as much effort as we think it would have. And this is that on a large scale, and because of that he's been training to be a wizard for a very long time, but he actively fails the exam by like 1% every time it comes around. So he's getting to the point where the head wizards are starting to feel like this can't go on, and he decides to get a job in Hollywood, which is new to the Discworld and is looking for actors to pay rubbish money in order to star in their movies. And it's just kind of impossible to explain or sell to you if you have no interest in the Discworld or haven't read anything in the Discworld. Like, the charm of Terry Pratchett's books is so unique that like you have to read them to find out. But you know, this was just like another solid story in the Discworld that I really enjoyed. I don't regret putting off because I'm still terrified to finish the series, but I did enjoy finally getting around to reading it. So yeah. For those wondering where all the Greek mythology is though, I do have 2 books which explicitly deal with Greek mythology, so let's talk about them next. The first one is a YA novel called This Poison Heart by Kailyn Bayron. So I have previously read Cinderella is dead. Cinderella is not dead. Cinderella is dead. Oh my god, I've forgotten the title of the book. By Kailyn Bayron, which is a YA retelling of Cinderella, which I really enjoyed. And this is a book which is not a direct retelling of anything. It's a new story about a new character in our modern day world, but it is Greek myth adjacent, because in this world the figure of Medea is treated as a historical figure, and there are allusions to Greek mythology throughout the book, and there are allusions to and ties to Greek mythology and figures of Greek mythology throughout the book, some of which I don't want to say too much about because I don't know how much you want to know before going in, because it gently unravels as it follows through, but you can expect to have your like interest in Greek mythology like whetted by reading this book. The story itself revolves around Briseis, who is a young girl with a particular gift. So she has some sort of affinity with plant life. One that she doesn't entirely know how to control, but when she gets angry, plants explode into like massive blooms, and when she gets sad, plants wilt, and plants bend towards her like she's the sunlight, and it has caused her some troubles in the past because people sometimes notice that the plants are doing strange things when she's around them, and in some ways it's also left her quite isolated. She doesn't really have any friends at this point. It's just her and her two mothers who run a florist, funnily enough, in New York, and things generally just haven't been going great of late. Then it turns out that Briseis's biological aunt, because she was adopted by her two mothers, has apparently recently passed away and left her family home, which was also the home of her biological mother before she passed away. And they inherit this home. Well, Briseis inherits this home, but you know, she's a minor. So her and her parents decide to like move to this home upstate, maybe, I don't know, it's like more in the countryside. I don't really know the geography of that area or any area in the US very well, but they moved to the like more rural part, but they moved to a more rural area where this house is located and decide to like give it a spin, see if this could be what they need. You know, the rent was about to go up on their flat, so naturally owning a home's got to be better. But when they get there, Briseis discovers all of these plants and this garden full of plants used in like healing and magic and then even poison, and it's clear that her gift is one that has been passed through her biological family, and she's having to learn about that and discover what that means, as well as potentially come under threat from other people who know what her gift is and know what her aunt's gift was and have a vested interest in accessing that gift. And it's really, really interesting how it plays with Greek mythology, which, like I said, I won't give too much away about, but I really, really enjoyed that aspect of it because it really put like a fresh spin on some of those stories, while also like just like playing on that theme of their interconnectedness in our life and history. And I really enjoyed that, and I really enjoyed the character of Briseis, and I enjoyed the mysteries that started to develop in book one that I'm excited to see conclude in book two. I think it's just a geology anyway, but I'm excited to like follow through in book two. And I also just really enjoyed the queer rep and the dynamics between Briseis and her family and the friends she made, and I thought it was a book really rich in character. And that's not to even touch on the beautiful descriptions of plants and the magic system in this world. So, you know, phenomenal. And that brings us to Greek mythology themed book number 2, which is, and I don't know if you'll be surprised to know this, I actually have no idea, tell me if this was a surprise or not, Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. So I actually filmed a vlog a few months ago where I read Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief for the first ever time. Yeah, I know, like ancient history, classical mythology nerd through and through, but I kind of missed the Percy Jackson thing as a kid. Like I was a little bit old when it came out and then never got around to it. And as an adult, I think I was a little bit scared that as an adult who was so immersed in this stuff that I wouldn't be able to enjoy it. Like I wouldn't be able to just put like my fun reading lens on. I would be too critical of it. And for that reason I decided, you know, I'll vlog the experience. We can go through it together. We can see what I think of it. I can talk about the myths that inspired it and just react to it as a reader as well as an ancient historian. And I was so pleasantly surprised. Like that is such a compelling middle grade book. I think it's sort of like older middle grade, maybe verging on YA, but it is so well done, and I really get why it's such a like fan favourite that is so ingrained in a lot of people's like childhoods and teenage years, and then if you were that age when it came out, because I would have loved that series when I was a kid. Like I would have been obsessed. I would have been buying them all. I would have been on book 2 immediately, and I still want to read book 2. But even as an adult, I thought it was really entertaining and really enjoyable. And you know, I nitpicked a bit in my reading vlog because that's what you gotta do, right? I had to say this is an odd choice pertaining to Greek mythology, or this isn't maybe what I would have done, or this isn't exactly how it is in the original. But as a book that just took aspects of Greek mythology that a lot of us are familiar with and ran with it and created this modern world, imagining what it would be like if the Greek gods still played such an active part in the human world, and if they had half mortal kids now like they did in the Greek myths, what that would be like. It was so well done. It's so imaginative and creative, and it's really well paced. Like, I just found myself turning that page. I was invested in Percy's story, his friendships, his relationship with his mum, discovering who he was. It was great fun. Like, I really, really enjoyed it, and I think part of my enjoyment came from the fact that I was so surprised by how much I enjoyed it. So, like, seal of approval from this ancient historian. It's just a good children's book, right? Like, it's just good. And I do want to get around to reading book 2 and later books in the series. I hear there's more queer characters introduced, which I think is something that's fantastic and nice to see the representation of. So yeah, looking forward to that, and I'll probably watch the Disney series when that comes out, so had to mention that here. You can watch the full vlog if you'd like to see all of my reactions. I'll link it down below. Since we've been kind of working our way down the ladder of age ranges, let's carry on with the kids books. The next one I actually want to talk about is another middle grade book called The Jumbies by Tracy Baptiste, and this also deals with folklore, but specifically Caribbean mythology and folklore, which is not something I have read in a children's book before. I have not come across a children's book inspired by Caribbean folklore, so that was really just nice from that perspective of something fresh for me, because I'm always looking for more books, whether they're for children or adults, that retell or take inspiration from folklores of the world. So the book naturally is partly about jumbies, which are a sort of malevolent spirit in Caribbean folklore. Now, jumbies is sort of like an all-encompassing term which includes different spirits, but as a group they're known as jumbies, and they occupy the Caribbean islands and can pose a threat to the lives of people on those islands. In some ways I could see parallels with like the fair folk of Scottish folklore that I grew up with, who are also very dangerous and insidious in some respects, and it's also just interesting to see how kind of so many different cultures have a kind of malevolent fairy or spirit as a part of their folklore. So the jumbies in this story basically lurk in the forest, beside which our main character Crean has grown up, and she has grown up basically just her and her father. Her mother died when she was very young, and she has like never been scared of the jumbies until one day she spots something in the wood that she hasn't seen before, a pair of eyes. Coincidentally, the very next day, a new and strange woman moves to town. Now, we all know from the offset, even before Kryn does, that this is a jumbie, because we actually get the perspective of the jumbie women as well as Crean, and a few other perspectives dotted in there. And it's basically Crean's fight for her family, for her father, for her people, for her friends, trying to protect them from these malevolent spirits, while also learning things about her childhood and her background that she never knew, and her father potentially never knew either. And it's just a lovely story. It's a lovely story about friendship and family, but it's also one that has these darker, creepier undertones because of the jumbie character and the spooky woods and magic that humans can't understand. And I really like that in middle grade, like dark middle grade, like that sort of leans towards your goosebumps kind of horror is something I really, really enjoy, and I think kids really, really enjoy. So I'm always keen to find and read more kind of creepy kids books. I think they're a lot of fun because they very much go along the like things go bump in the night type of horror, whilst also like kind of reassuring you that everything can turn out alright. So yeah, this was a really, really lovely story and book, and I'd be interested in reading more by the author in the future. The last children's book on my list, however, I had to crack out my physical copy of, because we need to look at it together. We need to look at what is inside this book. So this is Smart About Sharks by Owen Davey. Now again, this is a series that you may have seen me talk about before, because it's genuinely, I think, one of the best book series out there. I'm not even going to say kids series, I just think it's one of the best series out there. For context, if you don't know, I've read a lot of books by Owen Davey before in this series. So there are books like Bonkers about beetles, there's one about penguins, but for some reason I can't remember what the title is, but there's a penguins one, there's Fanatical about frogs, and they're all about animals. They're all about different species of animals, and they're just full of fun facts, interesting information, and beautiful illustrations. Now, as a kid, I was an animal book kid. Like, I was obsessed, and I'm just gonna hold up some pictures while I talk, with like big non-fiction picture books about monkeys and reptiles and amphibians, and I had a few of my own and some I would get out of the library. Like, it was my favourite kind of book to read. I loved it. It's surprising that I didn't become a zoologist, but that was like my go-to genre of books when I was younger. It was what I loved to learn about, and this series has really tapped into that love for me in the past few years and eased me back into learning about the natural world a little bit more. So I've been able to learn a lot of really interesting information about animals from these books, and this year I picked up Smart About Sharks and was not disappointed. Sharks are very misunderstood, which is something that I did already know, but they are also such a diverse animal. Like, there's so many different types of sharks and they lead very different lives, so it was interesting to learn about them. They also very much vary in size. Like, this is a 2-scale picture of the smallest shark, which is the size of a pencil. Can you imagine meeting a pencil-sized shark? And I think it's made all the more interesting by the fact that Owen Davey is just like one of the best illustrators of all time. Like, his stuff is just gorgeous. He really captures the animals, even though these aren't photographic books. A lot of the ones I had as a kid were like photographs rather than pictures, but he captures the animals. I remember reading the frog one, where there's this frog species called the purple frog, and I was looking at the picture thinking, no way there's an actual frog that looks like that. This picture just makes it look really weird. And then I googled it and I was like, nah, that's exactly what the frog looks like. And now it's my favourite frog. I watched a whole documentary about this frog. I love this frog so much. It's the screensaver on my phone. So yeah, these books have tapped into a little bit of a childhood obsession for me, and they're so joyful and I really enjoy learning from them. They're very accessible naturally because they are for children, and I think children would obviously really enjoy them too. Plus, what I appreciate is that at the very end he talks about conservation and how we can protect these species of animals, protect their habitats, and what we can do to better take care of the environment that they live in. I really want an elephant one. Like, I'm just putting that out there in the universe, like, ecstatic about elephants maybe. Like, I want that. I used to watch a lot of documentaries about elephants as a kid, and I want a book about them. That, however, brings me to the last book on this list, book number 10, which is A House with Good Bones by T. Kingfisher. This is, back to the adult books, this is an adult horror novel, and it's the 3rd horror novel I've read by T. Kingfisher, but maybe the 6th book I've read by them. The other books I'd read were all fairy tale retellings, but this is the 3rd, like, straight horror book. And T. Kingfisher is probably my favourite, well, one of my favourite contemporary horror writers. And I think it's because she has this incredible, like, balance of ordinariness, mundaneness even, and horror and terror in her books. Like, they very much follow the lives of just a regular person who's still trying to do regular stuff like their job and clean the house and feed their dog, whilst everything is just gradually creeping up behind them and getting worse and worse. And I've also noticed, based on this and the Twisted ones, that T. Kingfisher loves a grandmother. Not necessarily loves the grandmother themselves, but loves a horror story involving a grandmother and a creepy house, which I am all for. Both are fantastic horror tropes and she does them well. So in this story, Samantha has to move home to live with her mum in her now deceased grandmother's old home for a little while between jobs. So she is part entomologist, part archaeologist, and spends a lot of her time on digs looking at insects. But between digs, sometimes she visits her mum, which is what she's doing here. However, when she visits her mum is not quite herself. She's sort of redecorated the house to look a lot more like it did when their grandmother lived there. She's acting a little bit unusual, and Samantha can't figure out why. Now slowly there becomes an indication that maybe it's more than just her mother grieving or aging or being ill, and it's maybe connected to the house itself. And if you like your creepy family history haunted house books, then this book delivers. Again, I love T. Kingfisher's writing. It's very witty. I found myself simultaneously laughing out loud while reading this book at the same time as like all the hairs on my arms would be standing on end. She really balances that very well and has an excellent, very like observational, witty sense of humour. And I also enjoyed her comments on archaeology and historians and the racism in people trying to argue that the pyramids were made by aliens. So like that was just like an extra little bonus point from me. So yeah, all round fantastic addition to my T. Kingfisher reading library, and I can't wait to read more. But those are all of the books on this list. Those are the best books I think I read so far in 2023, the ones that I wanted to recommend to more of you and encourage you to read if they sound of interest to you. But I can't wait to see what I read in the second half of the year and what new favourites I find there as well. Maybe you can even help me with that by recommending me some of your favourite books from 2023 so far in the comments down below. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everybody.